Hi, this is Dustin Hausner. I'm the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. All our Jewish programs is funded through the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. So I'm really excited for this particular interview. This month happens to be Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and this month we have a wonderful representative from an excellent organization. She's the president of OCA-New Jersey Chapter. Her name is Laura Lee, and we're going to talk to her about her organization as well as the importance of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So, Laura Lee, it is wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being invited, and that you're recognizing Asian Pacific American Heritage Month.
No, absolutely. So, before we get into the month itself, would you mind telling me a little bit about your organization? Could you tell me what does it stand for? What are some things about it, just for anyone who's unfamiliar with it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So OCA was originally organized as the Organization of Chinese Americans, and it was organized in 1973 in Washington, D.C. The OCA-New Jersey Chapter was established in 1978, and we were rebranded as the community expanded, and we really wanted to represent not just the Chinese, but all Asian Pacific Americans. So we went ahead and we rebranded as OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates. Kind of long, so for short, we usually just say OCA Advocates. But we wanted to definitely recognize and let everybody know that we do advocate for all Asian Pacific Americans. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we basically advocate for national civil rights and education. We have about 80 or so chapters and affiliates across the United States. And our mission is, advancing the social, political, and economic well-being of Asian Pacific Americans in the United States. So we do have some objectives, and they're basically to promote active participation of Asian Pacific Americans in both civic and national matters, securing the social justice, equal opportunity, and equal treatment of Asian Pacific Americans, of course, to eliminate prejudice, stereotypes, and ignorance, and to promote the cultural heritage, not only of Chinese, but of other Asian Pacific Americans, which, aptly, we're in Asian Pacific American, month. Our membership is open to all individuals that have an interest or a passion in what we do. We don't discriminate. And we have a lot of collaborative efforts. So for instance, one of our very special partnerships is that OCA Advocates New Jersey has a very strong partnership with FCC of Northern New Jersey and FCC of Greater New York. And FCC are families with children from China.
Wow.
So it's a wonderful collaboration because many of the parents are unfamiliar with the heritage, and quite frankly, they're unfamiliar with some of the issues that their children face. So they look to us to help them, not only to, instill that cultural heritage for their children, but also to give the perspective of someone in their shoes, right? So, if they're being bullied or they're being harassed or they're being called certain names because they're Asian, their parents have never had that happen to them. So it's a different experience for them. So they kind of look to us, to help provide some guidance for their children. And so, a lot of our programming is geared towards our members, what their needs are, what's going on in the, at the time. And so this year, with it, with it being a census year as well as an election year, those are two very, very important things on the agenda.
Well, it sounds like, to say the least, your chapter and organization are doing a lot of active things and a lot of great things that are very relevant. Let me ask, because it was brought up, obviously I mentioned that this is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and you use the term yourself. When people, I think, hear the word Asian, they see it as an umbrella term. It goes for Chinese, Japanese. So can you explain a little bit, what is Asian Pacific, or what is that identified as?
Right. So I think that, in general, what it means today, it's a way to identify a group of people, right? Anyone of Asian descent any American of Asian descent is classified as Asian American. But that's not how it started. It actually was, the roots of the term Asian American actually goes back to 1968. There were two UC Berkeley students, one named Yuji Ichioka and the other Emma G. And they were inspired by the Black Power movement. And it was, and the protest against the Vietnam War.
Okay.
So what they did was they founded what they called the Asian American Political Alliance. And it was a way to unite the Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino American students on campus. Huh. So it was really sort of, they kind of created that that broad term to sort of bring those groups of people together, because they wanted, it's like power in numbers, right? You have to have some commonality, and you're able to be more effective. So at the time that it was created, it was a radical label of, I think they called it self-determination with a political agenda of equality, anti-racism, and anti-imperialism. So it was an identity that they chose. It wasn't one that was given to them.
Interesting.
However, as the world has evolved and we've had many more, people come in, from different Asian countries, it's now a term that's used to identify them. In fact, I think that one of the things that happened was that the term Oriental, which is how we used to be referred to, that was found to be very offensive. They took this term, Asian American, and used that to replace that word Oriental. So that's how it started, and now it sort of is a umbrella term to identify people from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the subcontinent of India. So when you fill out forms, that's basically what the term is there. But I think that one of the interesting things also is that, when we talk about where it began, it was chosen, right? It was a chosen phrase that they wanted to identify themselves as in that arena. But there was, and if you give me a second.
Sure.
So there was a professor of Asian American Studies named Daryl Maida, and he wrote a book called Rethinking the Asian American. Okay. And one of the things that he found to be interesting is that if you were to ask an Asian American, like, just a minute. So if you were to ask an Asian American what their race or ethnicity is, they generally won't say, I'm Asian American. They're probably going to say, I'm Japanese, I'm Chinese, I'm Thai, I'm Filipino. So the idea is being that it's not something that we identify with as being a personal representation of, our family history. It's just one that is sort of an idea, other people use to identify us. So really it's more of an idea than it is an identity. So I thought that was kind of interesting because it's true. If somebody were to ask me that question, I probably would say I'm Chinese, but yes, I am Asian American.
So let me ask, because you mentioned obviously the older terminology of Oriental, which obviously for many is an extremely offensive term to call today. I'm curious, as Asian Pacific American or just Asian American, if you found that there is unfortunately still either such stereotypes that exist that are prevalent, or if there are things just kind of historically that have been very unique to, let's say.
Sorry, just a minute.
Okay. So yeah, I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about if there's current challenges that are faced, or if there are things that are very unique to the Asian American or Asian Pacific American experience.
Oh, absolutely. I think that there are several things. Right now, with COVID-19, you're seeing like this resurgence of xenophobia. I mean, it's always been there, but it's like really targeted bullying and harassment and attacks, sometimes physical, not just verbal, towards Asians. And unfortunately, because, you know, you've probably heard the phrase, well, you may not have, but I have, you all look alike, right? So because we all look alike, it doesn't matter what kind of Asian you are, you might be targeted. And unfortunately, right now, people feel like it's the Chinese fault that we have this crisis going on. And so you've seen a lot of attacks on, you know, on Asian people, whether they be verbal, and sometimes they have been physical, you know, so there's a lot of hate crime going on there. I think that there is a lot of resentment towards Asian Americans, and it's due largely because of what they call the model minority myth. And so many of the stereotypes that Asians face are born of the model minority myth. And, you know, as we all know, or maybe don't know, the model minority myth, you know, basically characterizes Asians as being, you know, very polite, very law-abiding, very high-achieving, hard-working individuals. And while that sounds very positive, and it is, you know, some people would even say it's admirable. There are a lot of challenges that we face because of it that people just don't understand. They're like, oh, but, you know, we think you're this and we think you're that, and they're all positive things. So why is it bad?
Right.
But the repercussions are bad. And what people don't understand is that there is a stereotype that we are judged by. And when so you're treated a certain way, number one, and if you don't fit that mold, right, then there's almost like a disconnect. Like people just don't understand. That must mean there's something wrong with you, right? So one of the things that, you know, I've seen a lot of, especially in students, is that they have that model minority, you know, standard attached to them. And so there's a lot of pressure, you know, undue pressure. And it's really detrimental because everybody's an individual, everybody's different. Not all Asian students are whiz kids, right? They're not, you know, particularly great in math. They're not all musical geniuses. You know, they're not being beaten over the head to study and work hard and get good grades and good SAT scores because of their tiger mom, right?
Yeah.
You've heard all of these things before. And their fathers, right? They're hardworking, they have prestigious jobs, but they are not in any leadership or, you know, executive level position because they're not, you know, they're socially awkward or, you know, things like that. So those are some of the things that are thrust, you know, upon us. But particularly for students, I think that what people don't understand is that, you know, they're not all straight A students. They're not all geniuses. And so what you find is that for the young, you know, for the young people, it's almost like they feel like they have to live up to the standard. And if they don't live up to the standard, then people think that it's because they have some kind of deficiency or, you know, they're just not trying, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, you can't be judged based on the idea that all Asian students are straight A students. So with that, they start to develop, you know, feelings of self-doubt. They have low self-esteem, you know, low confidence because they just are not living up to that expectation. And it can be detrimental. If you look at statistics, Asian American college students have a higher rate of attempted suicide than any other group.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And it's really because of that pressure. You know, that is society's, you know, interpretation of what they should be. So that, and, you know, the other thing that people don't understand, the other side of it, is the perpetual foreigner, right? Asians are often viewed as being perpetual foreigners. And it's characterized by things like, you know, where are you really from?
Yeah.
Right? But it's usually preceded by where are you from?
Right.
Right. So, you know, in most social settings, when you're meeting somebody for the first time, you know, it wouldn't be uncommon for them to say, oh, hi, Dustin, nice to meet you, right? Where are you from?
Yeah, and then usually
Right?
New York or wherever. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't usually hear after that, after your answer, where are you really
No,
from?
I've never heard
No,
that.
right? So what that basically implicates is that we must be from somewhere, we must be something other than American. And so that's the part that people don't understand, is that, even though it seems like a very innocuous question, the implications behind it. And it might bring about, deep feelings of the struggle, of, how your family got there, the things that they had to sacrifice, the accomplishments that they have made, and overcome. Yet, no matter what we do, we're still going to be viewed as foreigners, as something other than American. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. And then, to top it off, when people ask you, where did you learn how to speak English so well?
Mm. Yeah.
I always feel like I want to say, why do you need a tutor? It's kind of like a ridiculous question, but it's just an assumed kind of thing, which again points to the fact that I must not be from here.
No, I think it's something, well, certainly a lot to think about. And, I think like many people, I think we see it, we hear it, but we don't think about it. It's almost become so normalized. But I think bringing up that it shouldn't be normalized, and these are the instances where we should speak out, is incredibly important. So I'm really glad you
Yes.
these up to my, and obviously whoever's watching, their attention as well. So kind of to go into that a little bit, because I've always found with not only, unfortunately, stereotypes of discrimination, there's always history behind it. There's always, and I think when it comes to American history, I think when it comes to the Asian and the Asian Pacific experience, we really don't know very much. We know maybe little tidbits of here and there. So I'm curious, for Heritage Month, what are things about Asian or Asian Pacific Americans, like some of the heritage with this nation that you think people should know or people should know more about? I would be really interested to know.
Yeah, well, I think that there's certain things that are very important to know, not just because it's part of American history, but this way, hopefully we learn from our mistakes in the past so that history doesn't repeat itself, right? Absolutely. So some of the things that you see over and over again in the history of Asian Americans deal with topics that we are facing right now, and not just the Asian community, but a lot of other, immigrant groups, right? So if you look at the Naturalization Act of 1790,
okay,
it was the first time that there were systematic rules put in place to, for naturalization. Mm-hmm. And what it did was it limited naturalization to immigrants who were free white persons of good standing,
okay,
period. Right? So basically, it excluded, let me see, so basically it excluded indentured servants, slaves, free blacks, most women, and Native Americans, and Asians. So in 1870, Congress expanded that list for eligibility, and then it included not just white people, but it also included free black people. And then, and that was the terms that were used at the time.
Right.
Obviously now we say African American. And then came the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? And that was in 1882. And that was the first time that a law was passed that prohibited a specific group, right? And it's never been done, since. Okay. But Chinese laborers were prohibited from immigrating to the United States. And let's see, then the Magnuson Act in 1943 repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. But what it did was it set a quota of 105 Chinese people that the government chooses annually that can, immigrate to the United States.
That's crazy.
It did nothing to, about the rights of Asians, of Chinese to own property or businesses. And then it wasn't until the Immigration Act of 1965 that the Magnuson Act was repealed, and it abolished that quota system. And it took, 82 years from, beginning of the Chinese Exclusion Act to the end.
Wow, that is
kind of a long time.
And it's not that far away that it was repealed. That's crazy to me.
Exactly. Yes, I know. 1965. That's that's not that far away. So we see a lot of issues with immigration going on right now, and so I think it's important to see what has happened in the past and trying not to repeat some of those same things.
Well, one thing I'd just like to ask about the Chinese Exclusion Act, because I think I've read this from somewhere, and I don't expect you to be an expert, but
right.
that they actually had to have specialized ID cards, basically, that they weren't American, but they can you go into, because I find that fascinating, and we've heard examples of this in even today's immigration talk. So
yeah, they had to, the Chinese people that were here in the United States had to carry a card that basically said that they were allowed to be there. And if they were stopped or approached, or, very much the way I think of it is your car registration, right? Mm-hmm. So if a cop stops you, you're in big trouble if you don't have your registration, right?
Yeah.
So it's sort of the same thing. Mm-hmm. So if the Chinese people were stopped and they did not have this card with them, they could literally either be deported or put in prison. So, it's don't leave home without it, basically.
No, but
and they were the only ones who had to carry them.
Yeah, no, I find that incredibly just shocking and deeply saddened that was obviously part of our history. But, obviously I know there were other parts of the history. I know in recent history, or recent-ish history, I know people like George Takei has talked about the Japanese internment camps and some of the things like that. So,
Oh, absolutely. And I think that that's a situation that sort of, I don't want to say that we're seeing things like this, but I think that there have been issues in our very, very recent history, where we might be concerned. But basically, in February of 1942, right, and it was just 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, under pressure, from political advisors and military advisors, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And basically what we call the Japanese internment camps. And what it did was, based on, I guess, war hysteria, and concerns about national security, particularly on the West Coast, what Executive Order 9066 did was it basically forcefully evacuated and relocated about 120,000 Japanese Americans. And they, from the West Coast, and they were put into these camps that were called relocation centers, but we call them internment camps. And they were only given 6 days notice. So in those 6 days, if they were not able to sell their house, sell their business, their farms, or have somebody take care of those things along with all their personal possessions, mm-hmm. they would lose them forever, because they were only allowed to bring with them what they were able to carry. Mm-hmm. That's it. And there were 10 camps in all, and they were all sort of a little bit more in the interior of the West, and they were set up like barracks. So you had about 4 to 5 Japanese families sharing a tar-papered barrack, so it's an open common space. They ate in, it was cold in the winter, it was hot in the summer. They were eating in, communal dining halls, basically, mass-produced grub, so to speak.
Right, whatever.
And even though they were set up as towns, they did have schools, they did have post offices, they had, work facilities where they could actually choose to work and earn $5 a day in salary. right? They
Wow.
were, I know, wasn't that nice? There was also like farmland, so that they can grow crops and raise cattle, because I think the government was thinking that, it would be great if these camps could be self-sufficient,
Right.
but when you're dealing with arid soil, it's like, what are you going to be able to grow? So they were rounded up and they were put in these camps. They were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, and they knew that if they tried to escape, they'd be shot. And it happened. So, it wasn't a nice place to live, so here you are, and only, I mean, strictly because they were Japanese, right? So I think originally the executive order talked about, them being disloyal and, threats to society. But they were never proven. There was no hard evidence. They simply were Japanese, and so they were put in internment camps. And, the irony of all that is that many of them that were interred, many of the men actually fought in World War II for the United States, right? Yeah. And they themselves are asking why it was that here they are, they're fighting in this war, right? For freedom, basically, right? Yeah. But their families' civil rights were being taken away from them. So, it was kind of ironic. And I think that what's important, the plus or the positive note to take out of this is that those men became part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And it was a segregated, all Japanese regiment. And they actually, for the size and the length of their service, the size of the company and the length of their service, they were actually the most decorated unit in the history of American wartime, right? I think there was like 9,600, and I don't know the exact number, but there were, well over 9,000 Purple Hearts.
That's incredible.
They've received, I think, 8 presidential citations, 5 of them in 1 month.
Wow.
And in total, I think there came about like 23 medals of honor. So,
yeah, no,
that's the something to be proud of that came from this dismal, time in history. But I think the other thing that I thought was very, very interesting is that there were 3 cases that challenged the constitutionality of the internment camps.
Okay.
Unfortunately, of the 3, there were 2, and I'm going to have to look at my notes to remember the names. But there was.
While you're looking, one point I'll just say while you're looking in your notes.
Absolutely.
Is, you mentioned the internment camp, and obviously you mentioned that, yes, they got food and that they were able to work and they got schools, but they were held against their will. If they tried to escape, they were shot. I mean, I think
3 cases. And it was Gordon Hirabashi, Fred Korematsu, which is a name that many people might be familiar with. And then there was Mitsui Endo. So the first 2, Hayabashi and Korematsu, there were negative, their cases were negative, right? Okay. So they didn't win their cases. But it was Mitsui who went through a very lengthy trial, right, or legal battle in the lesser courts that prevailed. And so the interesting thing about that is that because they knew, even though her petition was denied in the lower courts, because they knew that she was going to appeal, they went to her and they offered her and her family the opportunity to leave the internment camps on the condition that they never return to the West Coast or to their homes, right? And she refused it, right? So, you're thinking about all the living conditions and, the fact that it's hot, during the summer, it's cold in the winters, the food is really bad, there's all of those things. in hindsight, she says when she looks back, she wanted to prove, she wanted to make it, the reason why she did it is because she wanted to prove that, you know, just because they were Japanese American didn't mean that they were, you know, that they were loyal or that they were a threat. Like, she didn't want to cave into that.
Yeah.
And it actually extended her stay in the internment camps by 2 years because it took that long before her case was heard in the United States Supreme Court. So the good thing that came out of that, I guess, is, and I'll read it for you, is that, let me see. So this is what the U.S. Supreme Court said. All right. So it got to the U.S. Supreme Court in April of 1944. Okay. So in, you know, after she said that she wanted to prove that Japanese, you know, people of Japanese ancestry were not guilty of any crime, that they were loyal American citizens, you know, and that's why she didn't want to leave. She wanted to make sure that, you know, that was proved. So in October of 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court's decision was that the detention and relocation centers of persons of Japanese ancestry, regardless of loyalty, is not only unauthorized by the Congress or the executive, but it is another example of the unconstitutional resort to racism in the entire evacuation program, right? Yeah. And then on December 18th, the court unanimously ruled that the government could not detain citizens who were loyal to the United States. And the day before that ruling, because he heard that it was, you know, the ruling was going to go that way, right, President Roosevelt issued an order allowing Japanese citizens to leave the internment camps. So he, you know, he knew that this decision was going to come down. It was going to go against his, right. So, you know, it's like the preemptive strike, so to speak. So, yeah.
So let me just ask, because the last thing I'll talk about history, because I do want to learn more about your programs and education, things like that. I've been interested, because you mentioned the Black Panthers earlier. A lot of movements in this country started from some sort of tragedy or some, you know, great speakers or leaders. I was curious, was there any such galvanizing event or leaders at that time that helped galvanize kind of this resurgence for the civil rights for, you know, Asian Pacific Americans?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that the most pivotal thing that occurred, and it's something that I find to be extremely important, and it's something that I make sure that, you know, most of the high school students that, you know, just a minute.
Yeah, sure.
So one of the pivotal events in Asian American history, something that, you know, I always want the students, high school students, you know, to know about, is the murder of Vincent Chin.
Okay.
And the murder of Vincent Chin was very, very important because it was June of 1982, Detroit, Michigan, right? And you had, the background is obviously Detroit, the Motor City. Yeah. That's where all the, you know, American auto workers and plants and manufacturing plants were. We're in a recession. A lot of the auto workers are being laid off, right? And at the same time, you're finding that Japanese automakers, you know, are moving in and they're having some success. So here we are again. You know, we all look alike, right? You know, that's what we're told. So Vincent Chin was a 27-year-old Chinese man who was celebrating at a bar, basically his bachelor party, right? He was going to be married, and he and some of his friends went to a bar. And there he encountered two gentlemen, two white men, Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz, who was his stepson, right? And they are both auto workers. They were. Michael Nitz, the stepson, had been laid off, and they, how do I put this politely? They exchanged, or they shouted, you know, racial slurs at Vincent Chin, you know, about the Japanese, you know, Japanese are the reason why, I'm trying to be polite here, Japanese are the reason why we don't, we're out of work.
Right.
And a fight ensued, and they were all kicked out of the bar. So outside the bar, the fight continued, and Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz went to the car and grabbed a bat. And they started chasing Vincent Chin, and he started running, and, he basically got away. And so at that point, Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz got in their car, and they drove around looking for him. They found him outside of McDonald's, and when they did, Michael Nitz held him down while Ron Evans beat him over the head with a bat.
Wow.
He died 4 days later. So the murder of Vincent Chin was, at that time, local news. It wasn't until months later, after the trial of Evans and Nitz, that it exploded into a national furor. And the reason why it exploded was, here you have this young Chinese man, 27, obviously beaten to death, what I would call a hate crime, right? And the two men who were responsible for it basically paid they got 3 years probation. They paid a $3,000 fine, I guess they paid a $3,000 fine, and that was it. They never spent not a single day in jail.
And can you remind everyone who's watching what year that was?
1982.
1982.
So it's not like it was ancient history, right? It's not that long ago, but it's long enough ago that we want to make sure that people remember it, that they don't forget it, because that in itself was a galvanizing, as you said, moment in Asian American history. It really brought different Asian groups together again, just like back at Berkeley, right? In 1968, you had this, sort of like unionizing, group of different Asians coming together to fight civil rights. And, basically it's because these gentlemen got away with murder, right? They didn't spend not a single day in prison. And the judge who presided over the case said that, I guess his reasoning was that, here you have this man, Ronald Evans, he's, he's held a responsible job for like 17 or 18 years. His son was, going to college. He had a part-time job. You don't put people like that in jail, is what he said, right? He says, you don't make the punishment fit the crime. You make the punishment fit the criminal.
Sadly, I can easily think of a number of modern examples of that being used in court for people doing horrendous things, sadly. But to go in a bit of a different direction, just because me and you could talk history all day, I have that feeling.
Right.
I would be curious to know, like modern right now is, for your organization, what programs do you do and offer? I know you spoke a little bit in the beginning, but, especially with COVID-19, what are things that you did prior to it, and what are things that you're working on now? If you don't want to ask.
Okay, sure, not a problem. Some of the things that we're working on right now, obviously during this pandemic, it's kind of hard. Everything's virtual. We're trying to reschedule different things. There is a national webinar coming up on May 30th called Don't Hate, Advocate. And it is really geared towards, hate crimes right now that are being perpetrated against Asians. We also had one not too long ago on, being a bystander. So in the immediate future, that's the one thing that's in the immediate future. In the immediate past, we also did a program on the census 2020, to really sort of, I think that Asian Americans, when it comes to having a voice or being willing to have a voice, because they're very afraid of what the implications might be. And I think that there are a lot of, concerns, especially this year when the citizenship question came up, made people very fearful of, what that means. And we wanted to make sure that not just Asians, but everyone, that everyone understands that the census is aggregated data.
Yeah.
You know, that all census workers have to take an oath, you know, and by law, they are not allowed to drill down any information to any individual, right? It's just all, you know, aggregated. And so nobody's going to come after you and say, you know, you have too many people living in here, or, you know, you have somebody who's undocumented that's living here. You know, those are things that it doesn't matter. The important thing is that each and every one of them are being counted, right? Because that's how federal funds are allocated. So we did that. Right now we're in the process of completing our SA scholarship program that we do annually, and we usually would be having an Asian Pacific American Heritage and Scholarship Luncheon. In fact, it was supposed to be this past weekend, and it didn't happen. Everything kind of got postponed, and now it's going to become virtual.
Sure.
But the scholarship program is open to all college-bound seniors of Asian American descent residing in the state of New Jersey. And, you know, this year we're going to be giving away upwards of probably $9,000.
That's great.
So, yeah. So we do some service projects as well. We have been doing COVID-19 relief efforts, and we have been delivering, you know, food and drinks to, you know, some of the frontline workers at hospitals around New Jersey, food banks. We've also expanded to any place where there is a need. We also do, we're doing a crochet circle, which is something that we can do kind of from home.
Yeah.
And do you crochet?
I've tried it before. I'm not very good at it, but I'm familiar of its existence. But that's actually very clever. I have to give credit. That's a clever.
Yeah. So, you know, we could all just, like, you know, kind of crochet in our own place, and we can, you know, I guess FaceTime each other if we want to, and we have different projects and different beneficiaries. Like right now we're working on lap blankets for hospice patients. Yeah, we do. We have an ongoing toiletry drive, you know, for like shelters and things that, you know, where they don't have shampoo or soap or, you know, any of those types of things. What else do we do? And we do a lot of educational programs as well. We did one in February before all this happened, called Personal Safety and Awareness on college campuses and in crowded public spaces. So those are some of the things that we've done. We also do like a member appreciation luncheon in October. And last year we had the benefit of having a gentleman named Russell Lowe, who wrote a book called 3 Coins. And it was a very, very interesting book because it's a book about his great-grandparents, his great-grandfather who worked on the railroad, and his great-grandmother who was basically smuggled into the country as a young girl to work as, you know, a servant in households. I had also this past year, one of the things that we did that to me was very, very important was the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike, which was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And, you know, which if people don't know, there were 2 railroad companies, one from the east going west, one from the west going east. And they were trying, you know, the idea was to build a railroad that would connect the east to the west, which would have significant, you know, economic benefits. It would, you know, accelerate westward expansion and all those things. But the people going from the east, the railroad going from the east to the west, basically went through flat plains, right? They did face struggles with, you know, native Indians because they're going across their lands. But the people that were going from the west to the east had to go through the Sierra Nevada mountains, right? Which was a big struggle. And because they were having a hard time keeping labor, they decided to employ Chinese laborers. And eventually, and, you know, who proved to be very hardworking. And eventually they made up like 80 to 90% of the workforce on the Central Pacific Railroad, which was the railroad that was going from the west to the east.
Mm.
And there were a lot of things that happened along the way that I think are very interesting and important in history. And if you've, they had to build, for instance, they had to build like these huge trestles to blast tunnels through the granite of the mountains. And so I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, doesn't stand a Chinaman's chance, but have you ever heard that?
I think in a history thing I heard that, and I haven't heard it in a very long time, to be honest.
Yes. So it's a very old phrase. You may not hear it very much these days. These days, it refers to a situation where we might say someone's in a no-win situation.
Okay.
And it was it referred to the lucky Chinaman who was either lowered in a basket from above that had to put the black powder and light it to blast through the granite and pray that his coworkers can get him out, or like reel him up fast enough that he avoids the blast. Or what they call a runner, on the ground, they would put the black powder. And can you hold on a second?
Yeah.
So the runner basically had, was usually the fastest guy. And he would do the same thing. He would put the black powder there and he would light it, and then he would run away from it, right, to avoid the blast. And so if you think about this, little by little, he's going to go in further and further and further and further, right? Which means that he's going to have a much further run coming out. So as the story goes, most people didn't, most of the guys didn't last more than a week. Because in a week's time, right? I know. So, it was a monumental feat to complete the railroad, but there were a lot of lives lost. And at the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad, or the Golden Spike, May 10th, right, 2019, Chinese Americans were able to reclaim, their place in history. Something that should have happened, long, long ago. If you go back to the actual date in 1869 when the railroad was complete and the ceremonial Golden Spike was hammered in at Promontory Summit in Utah, they had this celebratory photograph that was taken that actually featured actual workers from the field that worked on the railroad.
No kidding. Wow.
Yes, and it famously became known as the champagne toast. And if you ever, Google it or whatever to see the picture, you will notice one important thing, and that is that there was not one single Chinese face in the picture. So, that tends to make you think, well, did you forget that, especially, right, especially like, from the Central Pacific Railroad, 80 to 90% of the workers were Chinese. Why are they not represented in this picture?
Right.
And at the 100th anniversary, there was an activist named Philip Choi who brought with him, he did receive the telegram because he wanted to recognize the contribution that the Chinese had made. And he did receive the telegraph saying that, yes, we do have a place for you. You'll be able to speak. He had commissioned a bronze plaque to commemorate the Chinese workers that worked on the railroad. He brought with him a couple whose parents had worked on the railroad. And what happened was when they got there, unexpectedly, the actor John Wayne made an appearance. And because he made this appearance, they got knocked off the program.
That's terrible.
And at the time, the Secretary of Transportation, John Volpe, made a speech about who but Americans could build, could complete this monumental task to build this railroad that has, significantly contributed to, the building of America.
Right.
And then, so that happened at the 100th anniversary. And, one of the things that would occur on the anniversary of the Golden Spike was a recreation of this photograph,
Mm-hmm.
the champagne toast.
Step down.
And it wasn't, yeah.
Good.
And it wasn't until 2014,
Yeah.
there's a civil rights photographer named Corky Lee, and he was granted permission to organize and assemble and recreate that photograph with Chinese people in it.
Good.
So it was 145 years later.
Yeah.
We had our first photograph that actually depicted Chinese people in the photograph. And then, you know, we go to the 150th anniversary, and unfortunately, Philip Choi passed away a couple of years ago. So he never lived to see the day. But the daughter of the couple that he had invited with him to the 100th represented her parents at the 150th, and her name was Connie Young Yu. And then the other irony of it all is that the Secretary of Transportation, you know, in 2019 was Elaine Cho, who herself is a Chinese immigrant. So she was able to get up and, you know, and she did make reference to the speech that, you know, her predecessor had made at the 100th about who but Americans, and, you know, definitely gave credit where credit was due, and included, you know, the thousands of Chinese workers that not only painstakingly worked on it, but also many of whom died to complete it. So I was very happy to be able to participate in it and to see it firsthand. And I actually recently found out, and this was something that, you know, it's interesting because Russell Lowe, I told you, who wrote that book about his ancestors, it was by chance that he found records of one of his uncles who had kept a journal through all that time. And that's how he got the material to write the book. Mm-hmm. And, you know, meeting him inspired me, as well as many other OCA members, to sort of dig into our family histories. Yeah. And I finally found out and confirmed that my maternal great-grandfather was a railroad worker. Oh, wow. So I am a Chinese railroad worker descendant.
There you go.
So that made me really happy. So it was sort of extra special that I was able to make it to the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike, and that all those wonderful and great things happened.
No, that's, to say the least, that's an absolutely incredible story, and I'm really glad you shared that with me and whomever is watching this at the moment. But the last two questions I'll ask, because this has been, for me, a great enjoyment of knowledge and learning through this interview, so I'm extremely thankful for it. For anyone who's watching, I'm curious, because we've talked about so much and there's so much going on, what would you want their takeaway to be for, I suppose, not just the month itself, but in general, for, you know, learning, or for whatever you think is appropriate? What would you want?
Well, I think that the most important thing, takeaway, is that we are all immigrants. We are all immigrants. We all come from somewhere else. I mean, unless you're Native American, your ancestors came from some other country to America. Yeah. So, you know, no one, and I think that once people sit back and they realize that, you know, then I think that they realize that, or they should realize that no one person or, you know, ethnic group can, you know, has a stake in America more than another. You know, I mean, we all have made contributions. We have all struggled. We have all, you know, achieved things that contributed to the fabric of the United States. And, you know, once we understand that and we kind of look past, you know, what I look like, or what you look like, or where you came, or where your ancestors came from, you know, when you ask somebody, where are you from? And they say Ohio, that's where they're from. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's not like, where are you from? No, where are you really from? You know? And then I'm like, well, you know, if I were to say New Jersey and they're like, no, where are you really from? And I'm like, oh, well, New York, I guess, because that's where I was born. You know, it's like, that answer should suffice, you know? And I learned how to speak English because I was born here. I don't know. I just want people to understand that we're all very unique, and we all have made contributions, and we all belong here, We're all citizens. It doesn't matter. And, somehow we just have to come to a point where, we have that understanding and that tolerance. So that would be the takeaway for me.
And I think it's a beautiful and very appropriate takeaway. And the very last thing I'll ask you is just if anyone wants to learn more about your chapter or what programs you're doing or things like that, can you let me and whoever is watching just know where the best to...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the best thing to do is for the local chapter, OCA-New Jersey, if you go to www.OCA-NJ.com. You will get to our website, and there you will see the latest, latest and greatest of what we're doing, what we're working on, updates to our calendar events, because as I stated, there are things that are being postponed and changed and, on the fly, and, trying to figure out ways to be able to still get people together, but stay 6 feet apart. So, normally in September, we have our 4 chapter FCC picnic at Van Zandt Park, which is the New Jersey chapter, the New York chapter, the Westchester Hudson Valley, and the Long Island chapter, along with FCC New York and New Jersey. We have this big, huge picnic, and we invite everybody to come out at Van Zandt Park. I don't know if in September that will happen. In December, we always have our annual holiday ball, which is our major fundraiser that supports the scholarship program. And hopefully we'll be able to do that as well. So all of those, up to the minute things, the programs that are going on, the webinars that are going on, those are all up on the website, OCA-NewJersey.com.
Well, I want to sincerely thank you, Laura Lee, for this wonderful, enlightening interview. I certainly learned a lot. I hope for those who are watching, you learned a lot as well. Continue to stay safe, continue to stay healthy. We hope you'll watch more of our videos. We hope you'll look up the OCA New Jersey chapter, as well as the organization as a whole. Laura Lee, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Dustin, thank you so much for inviting me.